welcome. I'm delighted to welcome you to another Books and Coffee presentation. And I want to thank those of you who are friends in the audience. Your donations make this program possible. And for those of you who are not yet friends, I hope you soon will become a friend. And you all filled out raffle tickets. At the end of the evening, our author will pull a name out of the basket, and that lucky winner will get a signed copy of the book. And for others, our bookseller will be here. It's not here yet, which after the presentation, and we'll be selling books outside. So now I'm delighted and honored to welcome our author, best-selling author, Lee Woodruff, to Concordia. After hearing about her over the years from a mutual dear friend and great Concordia supporter, Mimi Gerbst Hartfield, that professional name and family name, I always get confused, and reading Lee's book in an instant, which she co-wrote with her husband, chronicling her family's journey to recovery following Bob's roadside bomb injury in Iraq, as well as her reflections on life, marriage, family, and friends in Perfectly Imperfect, A Life in Progress, I feel as if I've come to know her. And she is a remarkable woman. She's thoughtful, honest, forthright, family loyal, funny, and extremely accomplished. In addition to being the best-selling author, raising 4 children, Lee is currently a contributor to CBS This Morning and a founder and spokesperson for the Bob Woodruff Foundation, assisting wounded service members and their families in receiving the care they need and helping them successfully reintegrate into their communities. She's a graduate of Colgate University and ran her own public relations and marketing consulting business for 16 years. And now, with Those We Love Most, she is a best-selling novelist. Quite an impressive list of accomplishments. Flawless, breathtaking, and oh so real, raved Harlan Coben. Catherine proclaimed Those We Love Most poignant and heartwarming. And Alice Hoffman declared Lee Woodruff knows how to get to the heart of the matter on every occasion. Those We Love Most gets to the heart of her reader, too. I found Lee's fiction to speak real truths. None of us is immune to grief. That grief is messy, exhausting, and complex, and our response to loss is deeply personal and unique. But her novel also speaks of resilience, what she refers to as a white-knuckle will to endure and move through grief. And I found myself thinking about her characters long after I closed the book. And I was hopeful, not only for them, but for me, that this novelist would have more stories in her and that there'll be very, very many more novels in Lee Woodruff's future. Please join me in welcoming Lee Woodruff.
It's always so nice when someone introduces you and they've taken the time to sort of look you up or Google you or write something instead of reading kind of your canned bio. But I do have to correct one thing that you said. I'm not very honest, okay? Yeah. I like to lie sometimes, so yeah. Okay, well, that's nice. Thank you all for coming out on this night. I think it'll be horrific outside weather-wise. So I don't know if it's started yet, if anyone just came in, but we'll try to get you out of here on time. But we're used to weather, right? We're Northeasterners, so that's important. So many things I want to say tonight, and I'm going to try to sort of wrap it all together. I'll probably read a little bit of a selection. Sometimes I always say to people, if an author just sits there and reads from their book the entire night, that's something that you could do when you buy the book. But I also think, as my sister said to me today, sometimes it provides the author's voice and context, and you hear what the author was reading and in the way that maybe they were thinking it. When I would tell people, and there were very few that I told, that I was writing this book, and one of them, my girlfriend Vicky in the front row, who's my walking buddy, we both got dogs at the same time, probably the greatest mistake of our lives, because we've ended up probably caring for them more than our children. But when Vicky would say, "What are you writing?" and I would start by saying, "Well, it's a novel, and I always wanted to write fiction. I was an English major in college, and if you had told me that my first 2 books would be nonfiction books based on my life, I would have really thought you were crazy, because I would have said, well, who would ever want to read about my life?" And writing fiction, writing stories, kind of scribbling in a notebook in a file of all these ideas I had was always the direction that I thought I would take. But I wasn't so good at sort of doing the elevator pitch, because I would say to these handful of girlfriends or my two sisters, well, it's a story and a kid gets killed, he gets hit by a car. And everybody would say, oh, I'm out. I can't read one of those books where a child dies. And I remember thinking when I was sort of going through some of the books that I have really enjoyed the most in my life, and I call them kind of the Oprah pick books. And if you asked me who are my favorite authors, they would be people like Jane Hamilton and Sue Miller. They would be people like Alice Hoffman and Ann Patchett. And they would be books where people were rolling along in their lives and something happened. Because in the end, my contention is, and many of you know this, and if we all live long enough, we will absolutely be able to confirm this, that we will all understand what it means to lose something. We will all lose our parents. We will all be that person who takes the casserole next door when our friend is battling breast cancer, or we will all, God forbid, come around together as a town. And I know a number of people that live in this town. It's one of those sweet towns that I imagine this sense of community sort of woven together like a basket. And I know, especially with my female friends in the audience, that simply what women do is they tend and befriend one another. And in those instances, we find our best selves, I think, when we are ministering to other people's pain. But we also have this mirror held up in front of us where we understand those bad things that can happen to us too. In the second book that Ellen mentioned, Perfectly Imperfect, which is really a book of essays. It's a book about what it feels like to be a daughter, a mother, a sister, a friend. I would say that it's a woman's book, but that doesn't do it justice, because I've had plenty of men. In fact, I love when this happens, and this is sort of the beauty of where publishing and books are going now. I'll sit down, I spend a lot of time on planes, so I'll sit down on a plane, and my whole thing is not to talk to somebody on a plane, because I spend my life talking, so when I go on a plane, I can read or focus, and invariably there's somebody you let your guard down, and they're just delightful. And every time I have done this, it's been a delightful person, and they'll say, well, so what do you do? And I don't want to say I'm, the author, I'm married to Bob Woodruff. I try to shut the conversation off, but ultimately, if someone goes through the series of markers and they get to the point where I say, well, I'm actually, here to speak about my book, what do you write? And if we haven't taken off yet, most of the men just download it right on their Kindle or iPad or whatever and start reading. And by the end of the flight, they're actually crying on some of the chapters. And so I think to myself, all right, maybe it's not completely a woman's book. But in that book, when I talk about some of the things that define us and some of those moments in our lives where we are going to meet what it means to lose somebody, those are the moments that I contend where we find out exactly whether or not we have the stuff to make it. And I can say after 6 years of speaking, writing, advocating for injured veterans through our foundation, just about 99.9% of the people that I have met, whether it's in a military hospital, whether it's in a book line after a talk, or whether it's somebody who emails my website afterward to share their story, just about every single one of those people has been somebody who has demonstrated the fact that in the end, we really are all built to survive. We may stumble, we may fall, we may have huge payback days, we may understand what it feels like to ask, why me? All of those things are part of the human experience. But in the end, we have to get both feet on the floor and get up the next morning, whether or not we have children, whether or not we have somebody that needs us or nobody that needs us, because I contend that that's ultimately what is buried deep inside of us. The first book, as Ellen said, was a book about Bob's and my journey when that moment happened, that in an instant moment that you hope never happens. And ours was that phone call that you never wanted to get. And I was in Disney World, actually, with my kids when I learned about Bob's injury. And my whole world took a complete and direct turn. I talk a lot when I do still talk about that book, and I do a fair amount about the 4 F's that sustained me during that period in time. And certainly faith is one of them, and I have a lot to say about faith, especially when I am speaking to kids who are graduating, because I think no matter what your belief is, I believe a belief system is a really important thing to help you at your very lowest moment. There's certainly friends and family, and I would not be anywhere without that. And then the last F is funny, because I think when you have a sense of humor and you can laugh not only at yourself, but at your dire situation, that's why gallows humor was invented. And my sister Nan and I, who is in the front row, we had the most inappropriate humor, because we do come from an Irish family, so we do like to laugh when, the old uncle falls down and is drunk. But we had all kinds of funny names for Bob. We called him the half-head when he was missing his skull and all these things. The nurses would walk in the room and kind of think, wow, this family's a little harsh. And when Bob woke up, he was displaying the same kind of humor. And I think that ability to laugh at yourself is really what can carry people through many, many, many dark days. Because I am that lightning rod for anybody who's ever had a traumatic brain injury or knows someone who has, and I'm so honored to be that person. I wish that I had known that person when this happened to Bob. I get a lot of calls, I get a lot of emails, and I try to take the time out from whatever I'm doing to help that person who's in pain. So one day I was in Kansas City giving a speech, and my cell phone rang. I was just about to head out the door of my hotel, and it was a friend of mine in Larchmont, and she and I had 17-year-old sons at the time. And one of her son's friends had just hit a little boy in his car, bright, sunny day. There was no alcohol, nothing involved. And the parents were really desperate to talk to me because they wanted to talk to someone who'd had a brain injury. And I said, give them my cell. I've got to go downstairs and do this work thing, and I'll be back in about 2 hours tops, and please have them call me. And the parents never called. I've never met the parents or the little boy, but I know enough in a small town, such as this one, you hear the stories. And the boy recovered. He's fine. He's back at school. But that was that moment that Colson Whitehead, the writer, says, don't go looking for your story. Your story will find you. And that stayed with me as I closed the hotel door and began to walk downstairs. I thought, wow, that phone call. And of course, it shocked me on many levels, because I too had a 17-year-old boy, and I was about to go out on college visits and all of those things. And so as I rode the elevator down, I thought, what would that, look at that one moment where he was on that road, that one moment, like my own husband, who had been in that tank, in that spot on the road where the IED was buried. Look at this family, that rock thrown into the pond, and the ripple effect. There's that boy who hit the kid. How do you come back from that? I call that sort of a Laura Bush moment. And what I mean by that is when Laura Bush was in high school, she killed a classmate of hers by just missing a stop sign. She'd recently gotten her license. Now, Laura Bush went on to do great things, but that story haunts me because there was a lot of stuff in between the Laura Bush that we saw as the First Lady and the Laura Bush who passed through that stop sign. And how do you move through that when you've taken a life? I thought about those grandparents. What are they feeling like now? Their grandson's in the hospital, and of course that mother. And that became the genesis for this novel, and I just sort of sat down and started writing. I wanted to look at the story from 4 different voices, from the grandparents and the mother, and I didn't want to really deal with the husband. I didn't want to have it be too much of I didn't want it to be a real analysis of marriage in the first sort of level of the onion, and I actually wanted to look at marriage from the older generation, and I wanted to look at the mother's perspective as sort of being the main heart of the story. In the original version of this novel, I had the 17-year-old boy, and I loved writing this 17-year-old boy because I wondered what would happen to you at this pivotal place in your life if you had taken a life. You could really go one of 2 ways. You would end up either in the local bar, never going on to college, or you could take that thing that you did, as I imagine Laura Bush did. And there's actually a wonderful book by Curtis Sittenfeld called The American Wife, and it's a nice story of Laura Bush and her journey and how she made peace with that. So one of the great things about having a really strong editor is by about the second pass of this book, my editor said to me, I love this boy's voice and I love this character, but it doesn't work to have him in the first person. So I really think we need to and that's really hard to do as a writer, to take out a voice and put the voice back in as a third person. But as you're reading this book, I share that with you because sometimes it's fun to know the backstory of how an author came to something. They felt like everybody else in in the tale, on the 360 view of this story, was connected and related. And the boy, who wasn't part of the family, was sort of the square side of a round wheel. I missed him, and he's become a character whose head you don't get inside. But there are a couple of key places where he appears, and I think that those are still really powerful moments. I did a talk this summer, and it was a little bit about writing memoir and a little bit about a lot of things. And I'm still new enough on the book trail that I want to refer to some of these quotes, although I'm one who's loath to read from notes. So what is this book about? Well, Ellen said it really well, but it is. It's a book about generations in a family. It's about marriage. It's about forgiveness. It's also about secrets that can bubble up, and what's a secret you can keep and what's a secret that's damaging. Each of the characters has a secret, including the 17-year-old boy, and you begin to see what those secrets are as the novel goes on. But it's also about that moment where you take your eye off the ball. And Maura, the mother, has a culpability in her son's death that you don't learn about until later. One of the things that I feel like the place that I'm at in life, and for you young students in the audience, this is going to sound like Methuselah to you, and for some of the other, let's just say mature people in the audience, not that the students are immature, you may nod your head on this one, but I think there comes a place, and I see this now in my 50s, where a lot of my friends have kids who are leaving the nest. And I think there's this feeling at a certain place, and I'm going to read this quote because I love this quote. There's a book called The Slippery Year by Melanie Gideon, and it's a great book about marriage. It's about a year that she goes through a lot of things in her marriage. I love reading memoirs, and a really well-done memoir with a great voice is powerful. And I wrote this and stuck this in a file at some point in time, but she says, marriage changes passion. Suddenly, you are in bed with a relative. I can't remember who thought this saying up, but I'm sure it was a woman who was lying awake while her spouse snored loudly beside her. And so in some of what I see in this midlife place, where I call it this sort of the luffing the sails place of marriage, it's very easy to think that if you maybe cut and run because you're just so darn tired of his snoring, that there's something better out there, that maybe on Match.com exists the perfect person who will hit every point in your checklist. And in some of the people that I know who have sort of made that decision in towns all around the country, because Bob and I have lived in many places, they're almost invariably, and believe me, there are certain marriages that should never stay together, but probably 75% of those friends at some point have sort of limped back to me and said, I acted too hastily. Everything that I really did love and value most was right in front of me the whole time, and I just didn't appreciate that enough. And two of the characters come to that place in the book in very different ways, and one of the things I wanted to look at is the very different nature of the two generations. This Maura, the mother, is younger than I am, and so her parents are younger as well. Her parents kind of came of age during the Vietnam era, and but they came from the Midwest in a very Catholic upbringing, so they never got sort of swept up in the counterculture stuff. And they are also harboring a secret, which I will not tell you. But one of the things, my favorite character in the book is the grandmother Margaret, because she is based on a composite of many women of my mother's generation, including my mother. And although my mother doesn't go into the garden shed and sneak cigarettes like Margaret does, my mother is very much a, let's just soldier on. And I had the opportunity to talk to my mom and some of the folks she lives with in Concord, Massachusetts, and I looked at her and I said, Mom, if I had to sum up, I think what your generation would say to my generation, it would be, stop whining, lace up your boots, please stop talking about all your feelings and emotions, and you have things to do. You have people to take care of, and you have to keep putting every single foot on the floor each morning. So get over your darn self. She kind of gave me a cute little smile like, oh, Lee, you're right. By the way, when you're a speaker here at Concordia, you get your picture on the water. And I would like to say, I have to take a picture of this later because I have never had that happen, although I'm sweating a little bit here in this picture. But I think that was pretty cool, frankly. It tastes so much sweeter when yeah. Margaret, Margaret's the heart of the family. Margaret loves her children. She loves her husband despite his flaws. And Margaret is really that voice in the family who brings her daughter back to life, who above all else has to overlook so many little things and understand that family is ultimately what matters. And I think there's an awful lot to respect in that generation of people. And I think we're making marriage incredibly disposable and commitment and all of these things. And I always get all these unnecessary and not worthy sort of laurels for being the woman who's stuck by her man when the chips look down. And I sort of look at people when they say that to me, and I think, well, what were my choices? And I know in the darkest moments when Bob was in his coma for those 36 days, it never once occurred to me that if he never kind of came out of it, if he were a vegetable at a certain point in time, or if I were visiting a husband in a nursing home with 4 children, that was going to be my lot, that was what marriage was all about, that for better or for worse part. And I think I try to examine that in different ways in this story. And so you'll have to draw your own conclusions about how that comes out and who makes the right choice and who maybe makes a choice that might be too hasty. What else did I want to look at? Oh, of course, everyone asks the novelist. Every single novelist gets asked this question, so we'll just get it out of the way right now. Is this you? Are you writing about you? And every novelist rolls their eyes when they get asked that question because you totally write about what you know. And I know what it feels like to be in a loving family. I know what it feels like to be fearful by a hospital bed. I know what it feels like to not know what an outcome's going to be, and I know what loss feels like too. I know what it feels like to raise kids in a town that's on the North Shore of Chicago, which is where this fictional town is set. And I know what it feels like to have an intact family as well. But beyond that, these characters are not me. And it was Norris Church Mailer, Norman Mailer's wife, who wrote a book, A Ticket to the Circus. And she just, when I read this phrase, I thought this captures it. She said, every author uses the fiction crystal. And so what you do is you take your own life and experiences, because that's how you can write from a place of sort of security and power and knowledge, and you beam it through the crystal, and it comes out refracted in many different ways. And so it would be really hard for me to write about being sort of a slave in the diamond mines in Mali who's impoverished, because I haven't been to Mali, and I don't know what it's like to go to a diamond mine. But I can write about the things I know about, and the fun part, of course, is creating these characters who are not you, who can do and say anything. And my sister Nan and I were talking about this at one point, because she's working on a fictional book too, and people will often ask, which was harder? Hands down, for me, fiction was harder. Nonfiction was easy. You know the plot, right? It's your life, or it's the facts, or it's research. And yes, you have to weave it together in a cogent and interesting way. But to be given a piece of clay and just the barest outlines of a story, how many of you read the Pulitzer Prize-winning book Olive Kitteridge, which was a great and wonderful book, but if someone said to you, what's the elevator pitch on that book? What's that book about? Well, the description is 13 stories about an older woman in a Maine town. Boring! So you finish a back and forth between two characters. That can feel incredibly satisfying. What else did I want to tell you guys? This was a great quote, and boy, I guess I didn't write down where it came from, but sometimes contentment is a matter of will. You have to look at what is right in front of you and what it could be and measure it against what it could have been. It's that simple, but it's not easy to do because we are creatures who want and crave. And I think that gets at the essence in so many ways of that middle place, as I was talking about, that couples will find themselves in. If you told me that I could only take one book to a desert island, that book would be by an author named Wallace Stegner, who is sort of known as the great American Western author, and the book is Crossing to Safety. Somebody gave me that book 24 years ago. when Bob and I were married and we set off for China. And that book has no swear words, no sex, no violence, no crazy stuff that happens, but it's about a young couple and their best friends who are a young couple starting out in New England, moving to Madison, Wisconsin, and the journey that they take. It's the most simple, most beautiful book, and he's an incredible writer. And I decided on my 20th anniversary that I would read that book again, and it completely held up 20 years later. And I pulled this quote out of it because I think in so many ways it describes that moment that we will all at some point hit in our lives when we realize, as Maura the mother in my book does, that we don't write the script, that we don't have our hands on how this goes. And why is that important? It's important because it means to me, in what I've learned in my life, that we really need to be where we are at any given time as much as possible. We so easily toggle in our heads between past and present. Oh, I got to take the chicken out of the freezer and start marinating it for dinner. Or, oh my gosh, I forgot to put that memo on my boss's desk. And instead, here we are, next to somebody in the car, or on the golf course with our best friend, or out to dinner with our family. And the gift of understanding that an instant moment hands you the fact that you really don't control the script, that for a type A control freak like myself, I had to learn what it felt like to walk into a hospital every single day. And no, he isn't waking up, and no, we don't know with a head injury where it's going to end up. So I loved this quote, which has resonated 24 years later. You can plan all you want to. You can lie in your morning bed and fill whole notebooks with schemes and intentions. But within a single afternoon, within hours or minutes, everything you plan and everything you have fought to make yourself can be undone as a slug is undone when salt is poured on him. And right up to the moment when you find yourself dissolving into foam, you can still believe that you're doing fine. And then there's this quote, and I promise I'm not going to sit here and give quotes, but I sometimes I don't know if you do this too. This is why I'll never really go to ebooks, I think, is I read something and I grab my pen and then I underline it and then I bend the corner and then maybe I'll Xerox it and throw it in a file. And I find so much comfort in the written word and books. And I think the reason that we all love stories and the reason why we love fiction stories and memoir stories is because we want to be able, again, to hold that mirror up and say, me too, or I felt that way as well. Or we want to validate the fact that we were in pain in this situation and so was this character. But Anna Quinlan, another one of my really favorite writers, and she has a great book out right now. It's something like Plenty of Candles, Lots of Cake. I may have that wrong. Is that it? Lots of candles, plenty of cake, yeah. So asked what she would tell her 20-year-old self, she says, there comes that moment when we finally know what matters, and perhaps more importantly, what doesn't. When we see that all the life lessons came not from what we had, but from who we loved, and from the failures and losses, perhaps more than the successes. And I think that that's true, because I think in those moments where everything is up to you to figure out what's most important, you learn so much more about yourself than when you're up there getting the soccer trophy or you're at the Super Bowl tournament with the ring. Those are great moments, but I tend toward those stories that make us try to figure out what makes us tick, how we understand life. I was reading an article in Vanity Fair, and Ricky Gervais, it was with Ricky Gervais, and he was talking about how he developed that show, The Office, which was his baby. And he said, it's a show really where we feature life's boring bits. He said, these are the bits that other shows would cut out. And he was talking about the movie Diner, if anybody remembers that Diner. It's got to be, like 20 years old now or something, but at least, right? All I remember is the poor girlfriend who had to endure the sports test before she could date, and I so would have failed the sports test. But he was talking about, he said Diner is really the movie that inspired a whole generation of writers, from Jerry Seinfeld to Judd Apatow to Larry David, those moments, those everyday little moments that happen. And he said, Barry Levinson taught me that there's charm and interest and value in capturing the way real people behave. You don't have to have 90 minutes of shouting or fist fighting or blue aliens. Eavesdropping on the people who live in your local bar can be just as interesting. And that was, I thought, that's sort of a description of what my book is about. Certainly there's action, lots of hot sex. No, I'm just kidding about that part, okay? That would be 50 Shades of Grey, and that would be Sweeping the Country. But I love that. Those are the books I love. I love those moments. Who read the book, We Need to Talk About Kevin? So it was a really dark book, but I loved that book. And it's a book, and I won't tell you what happens. It was actually made into a movie. I never saw the movie. Not so good. There was a kid, and he was just sort of a bad seed. It was, I think, dealing with the premise that you can be the best parent in the world, but you can still have a child who you've given them everything you've got, and it's not going to turn out the right way. I was reading that book when Bob was injured, and when I flew on the plane to Germany to see him in the military hospital after he had had part of his skull removed and after it was very much touch and go, I was reading this book on the plane about a guy who ultimately ends up doing sort of a Columbine, really. I won't give too much away there, and my response was, okay, there's something worse than what I'm going through right now. Here's a worse situation. This would be worse. And it's that collective sense, again, of feeling a sense of community that other people go through things. There's another great book out now called The End of Your Life Book Club by a man named Will Schwabe, who was an editor somewhere, and his mother was dying. And so as she was going through her chemo treatments, they decided they would read a book a week together, and they would talk about it. And that would get her through sort of the pain of the treatment, and they could focus on the things she loved, which were books. And in the end of that book, he writes an acknowledgement to her, and he talks about, they're talking about the book On Chisel Beach by Ian McEwan, which is a beautiful book, I think, which just happens over a weekend. And he describes what his mother, the kinds of books his mother loved, who was an avid reader. And he says, my mother loved to read books about the way life really was, not the way we wish it would be, which is maybe sort of where the sort of Twilight and 50 Shades of Grey and all that stuff, and they all have their place, that sort of fantasy and dystopia and all of that stuff. But that resonated with me because I too feel like those are the kinds of books that have value in a book club. Let's talk about it. Did you ever feel this way? When did you encounter this? It's a really great book. It's really worth reading. So what else? Well, the other thing, I'm going to read a little section from this book, and then I'm going to stop, and you all can ask questions. But there was a quote that I found, and I don't know where I got it. I think it was just sort of a sentence somewhere. I'm going to share it with you because I loved it. I loved it so much I put it in the book at the very beginning. And it says, loss is not the end. It's simply an invitation to change. And when I read that, I thought, okay, that's how you got to look at this. You got to take the positive. You take the negative and turn it to a positive. I've had so many people ask me, how do you, I remember after Bob was injured and better and back in New York, and there was a really prominent psychiatrist who I knew just through different channels in New York, and she took me out to lunch. She asked me if we could go out to lunch sometime. Really fascinating lady, and we ordered our appetizers, and she put her fork down, and she looked at me, and she said, okay, I just have to understand something here. You've come through this incredible trauma. Why are you so happy and normal? And I looked up at her and I said, how do you know I am? You don't see me in my darkest moments. And when I have to laugh about that story actually is that I think we all have this illusion that people who are pasting on a happy face are okay. And we all know that when we go back to our deepest and darkest rooms, we have payback days, we have good days, and we have bad days. And that grief is not a straight line. Grief is a really twisted roller coaster. I think I'm able to write about that certainly because I felt that myself. But one of the things I think that really forged my ability to be happy and to keep moving was Bob's reaction when he came out of his coma. It was about 3 days later, and when he first woke up, he was really putting it back together. And his language would come online. It was his speech and language area of his brain that had been really injured. It was the primary insult from when the IED and the shrapnel hit him. In fact, I was doing a piece today, taping a piece at CBS News with a doctor who wrote a book called Concussions in Our Kids. And he actually gave the best description I've heard yet of what happens, why a blast injury, which is what happened to Bob and is what it's happening to 400,000 of our troops, our young veterans who have returned from this war, why a blast injury is actually different than maybe a sports concussion or a car accident, is that the incredible velocity of the wind, just the actual explosion of a bomb and what happens to the molecules of the air, just much like he was describing the way a big wind will sweep down a city street and hit the buildings and so become so much more powerful, that diffuse sort of wind is so intense that it rockets the brain back and forth, so many times that it would be the same as the extent of 14 or 15 multiple concussions, which is why you get this injury that happens all over the brain as everything just sort of comes apart, the neurons and the connections and everything else. So as Bob's were beginning to slowly come back online, I looked at him and I said, do you feel cheated? Do you feel robbed in any way? Do you feel like, why me? You had just been made the anchor of world news a month ago, 5 weeks ago, and you just got this position, the top position in your business, and you're injured. And he looked at me with this sort of little boy face that I will never forget, and he said, why not me? What makes me any different than the 25-year-old kid from Kansas just because I'm on TV? What makes me special? What makes me immune from the bad things in life? And I remember thinking at that moment in time, well, gosh, then how can I feel sorry for myself if this is how it's going to go for him, and he's lying here in extreme pain, and he's lost the biggest brass ring, in his industry, and this is his attitude. And I can't tell you that he hasn't had bad days, and I can't tell you that he hasn't had moments where he's probably asked himself that. But he certainly doesn't conduct himself that way, and he certainly doesn't live his life that way. And that, to me, has been the biggest example of resilience and moving forward in the wake of a big loss. The last thing I want to say, and whoever wins the book tonight, I was so remiss. I've had such a one thing after another. You get an extra prize from me because I usually carry in my bag an extra one of these, so I'm going to have to describe it to you when I'm done. But this book is dedicated to a little boy named Liam Witt, who is referred to as Prince Liam in the dedication because that's what his mother called him. And he was a 5-year-old boy who succumbed after the 3rd round to a really deadly form of neuroblastoma cancer. And as he watched all of the other children in Sloan Kettering on the floor that he was on die around him in those 3 years that he battled it, his mother never, ever, ever said the C word to him. She never told him that she had cancer. And she confided to me only 6 months ago that from the moment he got that diagnosis, she knew he was going to die. And yet she never uttered those words to any of us. She made us all believe that with enough love and enough hope and enough whatever, she could keep her little boy alive. And Liam died, and I was in another hotel room, and Gretchen was probably reaching out to a small group of friends on email and text as his life was ebbing away, which was a slow process of a couple days. And she wrote me the most beautiful email a couple of days later. I knew that he was dying, and it was an interesting dance to figure out how intrusive to be during that point in time, but clearly she wanted us to know what was happening. She wrote me a wonderful email about the moment that he passed, and she said that when he passed in her arms, he was looking sort of above him as if he could see something over her head and reaching for something with the most beatific smile on his face. And she said that he was in pain, a lot of pain, and the look on his face was the first time in a few days that he just looked like this was where he wanted to go. And it was something that she knew she needed to do, and the look on his face and where she thought he was going made this better. I asked her when I got to that part of the book, and I won't tell you what the part is, if I could use the basis of what she said. And in the end, I barely changed any of the words from her email because it was so beautifully done. And she said that all of his life, And he, of course, probably knew that he was dying. And he would say to her, "Mommy, I don't want to go anywhere that you're not." And she said that when he did finally pass, she knew that this was a place that ultimately she would go to. So Gretchen did what fierce moms all around the world do. She put on her battle armor when Liam got sick. And there was a drug that could have been put into production, but there weren't enough children, she was told, dying of this kind of cancer to make it profitable for the pharmaceutical company to do so. And Gretchen is a food PR person. She knows every top chef in New York. She works for the company called OXO, the Good Grips company that make those really cool cooking implements. And she rented commercial kitchens in Brooklyn and got every chef she knew, everybody she knew at the magazines and the food departments, and all the firemen that Liam loved, because they knew about every fire department in Lower Manhattan. And after he'd go get his chemo, they would go to the firehouse, and the guys would take him up in the truck. And he had his own locker at one of the closest fire houses to their apartment. And they all came down and baked cookies. They baked hundreds of thousands of cookies. And in the next year, with her dedication and hard work, they raised enough money to put this drug into production. And Cookies for Kids Cancer became Gretchen's cause in honor of Liam. And what they're doing is asking moms and dads and kids to hold bake sales all around the country and make cookies, because Liam loved cookies too. And whatever proceeds come from that, to send and try to combat this really insidious disease, the #1 disease killer of kids in the United States. So if I had my thoughts about me and wasn't just trying to jam something down my throat for dinner before I was leaving, I have a really cool spatula that says "Be a Good Cookie" on it from OXO. And every dollar, every cent that comes from the proceeds of that spatula goes to the foundation. So whoever wins will get your name and address, and I'll mail you that spatula, because my mission is to talk to groups like this and spread the love of Liam wherever I go, because I believe that books can do good things. I believe that books are ways that not only we can connect people with our stories and help us all understand, but I also believe that books can do good stuff. So I want to do good stuff for Liam. And with that, I'm going to stop talking and see if anyone has any questions about anything. You can ask about anything that has to do with any of the 3 books. And then, or do you want me to do the... Oh, great, okay. Or I can also rephrase it too. Oh, you're recording, right, okay. Can we get my face on the bottle for a minute if we're recording? Should I? Okay. This is the shy part. It's just like you're in class. My husband is great. He's playing tennis right now, somewhere right around here, I think. He had a year serious recovery, and then he went back to work at ABC News with a documentary that was released called To Iraq and Back. And it was his story, but he was insistent that it also be the story of 3 other veterans who were on this journey. And then with that, he sort of eased back into work, and it was a slow process. He couldn't work a full day at first, and he'd go into work and he'd have to lie down on his couch and rest, because a lot of a brain injury in the early days is about fatigue. He's back at ABC. The anchor chair cannot wait for someone with a brain injury. It's a very long-term heal, but he was just in the Pacific with Prince William and Kate, and he's going to LA tomorrow for something else, and he's working, and boy, that's a heck of a lot more than most people get with his kind of injury. He really shouldn't even be alive, frankly, with his injuries. So, and I have to give a nod here too to his employer, and Mimi was instrumental. She was on the tarmac when I flew back from Disney to just sort of pick me up off the floor with my kids. ABC News and Disney did everything right. And for most people who have a brain injury in their family or on the job, it's a really scary, resource draining, marriages don't survive kind of experience. So we really had a very different experience than most people have. We had exceptional and unlimited treatment, which is not how it's supposed to go.
Many times you read about a child who's very ill or something, and it causes the family, the husband and wife, to break up. And I can't understand that. What is it, that the marriage was not good to begin with? Did you think that that would bind them together, like in a purpose to get their child?
Together. She's asking, why do marriages sometimes break apart when a bad thing happens? And I think really the percentages probably do bear that out, especially when a child has exceptional needs that are resource draining. If we could solve that, we could probably help a lot more of these marriages. But I think as is in this book, fault lines are exposed when we're under stress. So where there were probably tensions already in a relationship, I was interviewing, I think it's going to be on Wednesday on CBS this morning, which even though ABC pays our mortgage right now, you should all be watching the CBS morning show. There are no Kardashians, there's no nipple piercing, it's Charlie Rose and Gayle King, and it's going back to the hard news roots. And they let me, get into some of the topics I want. So one of the story that I shot a while ago, but I'm doing Wednesday, is about intimacy in our veteran couples. And I can probably think of all of the couples that I've met who have come back and he's been injured, which has required a complete upending of the relationship. So here you have this strong, strapping Marine, and now he's injured and lying in bed, and she's the caregiver, mother/nurse, which is not very sexy and not what she signed up for at 24 when she met him at the bar and got married 6 months later and he got deployed. And this couple that I'm interviewing, he is a Navy SEAL. He's been in combat multiple times, going back to first Gulf War in Bosnia. And out of their set of 60 friend couples that they started with, they are the only ones left married. And you can argue that deployments and living away from home and being in war zones and the kinds of injuries he's sustained, which are multiple concussions and all kinds of other physical injuries, will ultimately take their toll in a marriage. And when you look at couples with children's issues, I think sometimes, and you'll have to tell me how many gradations there are of that in this book, blame is assigned, rightly or wrongly, but we all want to imagine it was somehow attributable to something. I have a daughter who's hearing impaired, one of my twins who's 12, and I write about that in the second book, Perfectly Imperfect, in one of the chapters called A Different Ability. And that's a chapter about anybody who's ever had something discovered with one of your kids that is not normal. And I use that word in parentheses because there is no normal. Our children are all these wonderful, amazing individual aspects of themselves. But Nora's hearing at first, when it was diagnosed, I was told that she was deaf. And my very first thought, after who's ever going to ask her to the prom, was, what did I do? Was I mean to somebody in 6th grade? Or did I have some prescription medication that caused, some chromosome to turn? And I think ultimately, if you let that fester, that can be a very damaging thing to a relationship.
Hi.
Hi, Doug Wilson. Colgate.
Colgate, yeah.
Go Gate.
Two things. I just wanted to mention that in that first book that you and Bob did, I loved the moment that you build up to in this horrendous, you took us through the agony as well as you could that you went through. But the moment that he woke up and you walked in the room and said, "Where have you been?" Or did he say something like, "Where have you been?"
Yeah. Like I was hanging out.
You made a laugh out of the whole, it was just a really wonderful moment. On the same subject of marriage, being of advanced age, I can look back.
But holding up well.
Being that category you referred to so gently, mature folks. I was in conversation with someone after the graduating ceremonies of a college that we both know in 1982, which is right about...
That's my year.
Okay. And I asked her about commitment for life to someone. And she looked at me like it was a concept that just her generation couldn't handle. Now we all admire you so much here for a lot of reasons, but what got into your generation?
Yeah.
What was it that implanted this idea that, marriage is just another step of going steady or something?
Yeah, and would you guys say, those of you in my generation, that applies to us, or maybe 10 years even younger? I don't.
Maybe
I don't-
younger too, younger.
I'm not sure. I mean, there's definitely a lot of marriages breaking up that I know. Okay, I may be going out on a limb here, and this is, of course, just my opinion, but I think a lot of things got upended in the 60s and 70s. I think who were our heroes? You know, our heroes got killed. John Kennedy, and, you know, whether or not you believed in his politics, it was part of our dream and part of where we were headed as a country. And I think as we grew up in the shadow of that, there was a sense of an impermanence, and there was certainly with the whole sort of turning on the country with Vietnam. That was the first time that we had questioned that a war was unpopular, and that our government figures were taken down. And then this sort of sense of, you deserve it. Tune in, drop out. You want to go do some drugs, you go do them. You deserve to be self-fulfilled. And I will call myself a feminist. I believe that I should be paid the same amount that a man, for what a man does. I absolutely will. And that, unfortunately, I think feminism has gotten a very dirty word with the generation of women who are coming up now. They also have a very short understanding of exactly what women went through. I mean, I can think back to my very first job, honey, sweetie, touch on the bum, and you knew you had to just kind of get by a little bit, right? You couldn't put a stink up with that. That wouldn't really float today. You'd be marched in HR so fast and out on the street. But I think that, and I sort of lost my train of thought there. I got off for a little bit, but my generation, I think a lot of that upheaval in the 70s, question everything, self-fulfillment, and the great part of the women's movement was wonderful, but I think certain people took that translation to be, if you're not happy, completely change it. And I think, what I'm saying is I don't want to throw the women's movement under the bus, because I'm a huge believer in the fact that we should all be equal. But I think all of those messages coalesced in a very turbulent time in our history. And we were talking about this just earlier. I don't think there are any parents doing their children, Ellen and I were talking about this, a service today in the way that we're parenting today. Because especially those of us who are working moms, we are so afraid to set limits and to put down rules. God forbid, we have to be our kid's best friend. I need to be my daughter's best friend. I don't. I'm actually a real hard ass, frankly, and a skinflint. But you know what? I look around me in the town I live in, which is just as privileged and as wonderful as Bronxville, and I see parents all over the place afraid to make the hard decisions. And I was sharing with Ellen a story that my girls are in 7th grade, and they went through a grueling tryout session for the soccer team in 7th grade, and there were 14 girls cut, and they went, they dealt with it. There was sadness, there was tears, teams were formed. When I tell you that one of the mothers went in and cried to the coach, and that a 3rd team was reinstated, and that my school buckled on that, I am embarrassed for where we're at in life. Guess what? Mom and Dad can't fix it, and you have to grow up, and in life there are winners and losers, and if you're not meant to play soccer, then let's go discover track or golf or tennis or something else. So we're doing this to ourselves now. You're not happy in your marriage, sweetie? Leave him. You deserve to be happy. And sometimes, like my mom says, you just have to lace your boots up, right? Stiff upper lip. Not always, but there's a combination in there somewhere. It's combo platter.
One other thing, usually, if you're leaving one marriage and you have a bunch of problems over here, you're just trading them for another bunch of problems.
Right, exactly. Right. He's still going to leave his, as I said to someone who I met the other day, and she told me she was divorced. I saw her at a book reading, and she said she emailed me afterwards. She said, my husband now has a 30-year-old girlfriend, and it's really hard for our kids, and it's hard for me. And I said, you just wait. Her boobs are going to sag, and she's going to start burping in bed, and she's going to nag just like the rest of us. I mean, right? So you got to just figure out how to make it work sometimes.
How you make it work, the writing, how you find the time for the writing?
Boy, I'm failing on finding the time for writing because I'm trying to work on something else. Well, a lot of it on the road. I mean, my sister and I were just lamenting, we can't write at home. There's an email coming in, there's dishes that need to be done. Oh gosh, I should have ironed that shirt for, my husband. So I try to grab it in odd moments when I'm traveling. I can write on planes and in hotel rooms pretty well. Writing books and being an author today is so different than it was 10 years ago because of social media. There are so many pressures. You ask about time to write, but in addition to time to write is time to market. And in the old system, there was a funnel system. So there was the, iconic writer reviewer from the New York Times Book Review, and then there were radio stations that interviewed authors and other newspapers that covered them, and all of these have been whittled away by budgets. So those traditional media platforms have gone away. But at the same time, there's been a proliferation and preponderance of book bloggers and the ability to put a hashtag on something on Twitter and talk about how much you loved a book. And it's actually a great thing for writers coming up who don't necessarily have the reputation or the track record of some other long-term writers. But it is very much of a time suck.
There you go.
All right.
Oh, one more.
We'll send you, Jean?
Jean Delfiner.
Jean, have you ever won anything before? Because we need to get her address, though. Jean, this is your lucky day. And I'll sign it out there?
Yeah,
Should
we'll
we
do
go
it
out?
outside.
Okay.
So we can move outside. I offer all of you to outside for reception, for book sales and signing. Lee, I thank you. It was delightful.
You're
It was
welcome.
wonderful.
It was really fun. I enjoyed it. I'm taking both waters, though.
Good, good, good.
Taking a shot.